Hello, John here. I'm in Glasnevin in Dublin. Realised I was passing, so I called in. And this is the part of the graveyard, the cemetery up at the back called the Poor Ground. It started back in the 1860s as the burial ground for various institutions like the workhouses like the South Union and the North Union workhouses and other institutions, and generally poor people who couldn't afford to pay for their own burial, or whose families couldn't and were paid for then under a separate system. And big square of land, highly organised, and I think what you'll find is if you ever visit Glasnevin that it's got one of the best burial systems anywhere. And if the same standards were used and the same systems were used in other graveyards as are used in this cemetery, we wouldn't have half the trouble that we've had about the anonymous dead in Ireland, knowing where people are buried. If you look over, you can't see it now, but on the far side there are every bit of ground here has got an identifier. There's row numbers, so I'm looking over beyond, I can see row headers: RA, QA, PA, OA, NA, MA. So they're running alphabetically from that corner there down to that corner. And then over on the far wall there, along the wall, there's column numbers. So everything has either got a letter and a row to identify exactly where the grave is situated, and they're all in here. I was given a tour of this burial ground by George McCulloch of Glasnevin Trust before he retired, and what he said, and you can see it now, he said it was excavated on a draft board pattern. So they dug a grave, left a blank grave, dug a grave, left a blank grave. So it was a more exaggerated version of a grave pit and a bank. So they basically did a hit and miss pattern, which allowed them then to go back and start again. They would have stronger ground to dig into if they had to repeat the pattern. So from the notice board over in that corner, they say they buried here from the 1860s. Went out of use, I don't know, seemed like sometime early in the 20th century, and then came back into use from 1947, largely thereafter associated with children's burials, and child mortality in Dublin at the time was so high that it became associated with with children, and it's now called the Angel's Plot, or it's the old Angel's Plot. There's a new Angel's Plot elsewhere in the cemetery. So if you look out there, any of the black splodges, all those splodges are all graves. So the whole thing, when you get your eye in on it, the whole thing is graves. And what I was told was that each common grave was a single shaft deep. Can't remember the depths now. They had to have, and they put multiple coffins into it then, of unrelated people. So you got your own space in a grave. You had about 1.5 foot of soil over you. Is that right? I think it changed when they were burying children. They didn't have to put as much soil over them. And you got a nameplate on your coffin, and you went in the register. And I do believe that if the Glasnevin team here were required to come in, open a grave and tell you exactly where a coffin was, they could do, because their system is that good. And I've seen reports elsewhere in the cemetery. Frank Miles did an archaeological testing here, and his report demonstrated that their system was fully traceable. There. These fellas, all the shallow, all the. Where is he? All those dark splotches look like graves. They are graves. So in these places that are highly organised, if we get our eye in on these highly organised places that have been used intensively since the 1860s in spells, then that will help us understand other places with somewhat similar burial regimes. I'm not sure if they had to repeat, if they did actually have to dig into the banks or the unburied sections. It'd be interesting to do analysis of that. In fact, I bet you their register will show you whether that's done or not. So we're here now with all those numbers on the walls. They're your columns or your identifiers. So this site is one of the most, on the surface, it's the anonymous dead. I think those large tablets over there on the left, they have the names of children of stillborn children who were buried here. So they're not all anonymous. But I'd imagine that anybody buried in here from the 1860s, that there aren't names here for them. They'll be in the book, but not here on the ground. It's an amazing place to visit because there's so many buried here. I believe there can be, when the children were buried here, you could get up to 20 coffins in a single grave. What would that mean if you were digging adults? I don't know. I'm only guessing now. I'll have to check the details, but you're probably dealing with something like 10 coffins per grave. And I think they were required then to have 2 or 3 foot of soil over the top of each coffin, of each grave. So you're losing a metre of the burial space because the bylaws required that you cap it off with 3 foot or 2 foot of soil. That's what we're seeing here. Like, why haven't they sunk more? Why aren't they more pronounced like we'd see in some of the I'm thinking particularly now old Sligo Old Cemetery. Is it that if there wasn't, I guess primarily maybe they were topping off the graves and levelling it off. The other thing that I note here now as well, that I open my eyes, is that the trees around the graveyard are a clue as well. Like, we know that the cemetery started in 1832, and there's a big oak tree. Him there, he's very big. Lime tree there, another lime there. We get measurements off those. There's fastigiatus all over the place. There's other types of trees all back beyond. Like, if we study Glasnevin as a well-run burial system, it becomes the line in the sand really for assessing other ones. It's done by professionals, that's the difference. I think when other institutions were doing this, they didn't have professional input, didn't have necessarily professional design, or if they did it persist? The bylaws would have set them would have given them guidelines that I suspect that they would have tried to abide by. Not necessarily saying they did all the time, or they could. They can have incompetence, bad management, all those kind of things. So the rest of Glasnevin is filled with grave memorials, whereas this square ain't. There's also a work yard over there that I think has got some epidemic burials in there, considered still to be potentially contagious, so it's what you'd expect in an urban cemetery like this. I definitely think if we're doing any study around the country, that this is if not our starting point, then it's our counterbalance for a well-run system. Is this potentially where the Union workhouse stayed? My understanding is that the death rates during the Great Famine weren't huge in Dublin, in the workhouses, but that they must have been higher, because I think people came from the poorer parts of the country, and went into their workhouses here in the city. I think they were also moved on across to, or they did move on across to the UK. So people might have survived Dublin and then died in Liverpool. I know there are mass burials over in Liverpool relating to the workhouse there. So is this where we're seeing the workhouse dead, even if the numbers weren't huge? Is this where they're buried here? If that's the case, then we're seeing a different burial pattern than what we've been identifying to date. We're not seeing linear trenches, but of course that could all be masked by later activity. We're not seeing large or square pit graves. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Just in summary, what we're seeing is this hit and miss burial pattern. Grave bank, grave bank, grave bank, grave bank, that they could then go back over and reuse. I suppose the question is for the historians here in Glasnevin is, would that register and the accompanying map? What dates are on that? Is it possible there were ever trench graves here and that the later system superseded that? Okay, gonna let it go now. Sad place, even with the traffic behind us, you can kind of feel it.